تناقش هذه الجلسة بالتحديد المواقف.
This session will discuss the regional situations of the crisis and accurately the Iranian situation, the Turkish situation, the Pakistani situation of this crisis. We will try in this session to know and to analyze the dimensions of these situations and to interpret the motives and the results. Matter of fact, no one can deny the role being played by Iran in this crisis. Iran is a contributing party in the Gulf security, in the Gulf region, and Iran understands, according to the geographic dimension, how big is the impact of such a crisis on the region. The paper to be presented by Luciano Zaccara will analyze the Iranian role and interpret the motives of this Iranian role. On the other hand, no one can deny the Turkish role in this regard, particularly with the Turkish role in the region. Turkey, 2 days after boycotting the diplomatic relations by the tripartite with the state of Qatar, Turkey has had its forces in the Turkish base in Qatar. And this situation from Qatar express the support of Turkey to Qatar in this crisis, and despite that, Turkey is trying to be balanced in its foreign relations with Saudi Arabia from one side and Qatar from the other side. Murat in his paper will try to give us an answer regarding so many main questions related to the motives of the Turks, the real motives behind the Turkish role in this crisis, and to answer some other questions like, is the Turkish role or the Turkish military role in this crisis, if it happened, will represent a tactical intervention just for a certain period of time, or will it express a strategic role to be played by Turkey that wants to be a party in the security of the Gulf? On the other hand, this session will discuss the dimensions and the situation of Pakistan and will interpret the Pakistani situation. As you know, Pakistan also has been partial regarding this crisis because it has stock relations with all the Gulf states. We cannot also ignore or deny that Pakistan, even recently before the Gulf crisis, within the Gulf intervention in Yemen, Pakistan has a different role, different to the Pakistani situations towards Saudi Arabia. Pakistan understands how big is this crisis, putting pressures on the internal Pakistani security, and Pakistan understands for sure that tension in the Gulf and the escalation between two main countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran will have its effects on the Pakistani society, which has so many sects. Zahid, Shahab, Ahmed will try to interpret the Pakistani situation from this crisis. You have the names of the speakers, and I don't want to talk too much. And 20 minutes are available for every speaker to introduce the main points of his paper. Then we will open the question and answers session. So at the very beginning, Zaccara will talk to us about the Iranian rule. The floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, the Arab Center, for inviting me to join this table. As the chairman said, Iran role is very important in the crisis, and it has been very important in the last years, moreover since the Arab Spring started in Iran. The current Qatar Gulf crisis erupted immediately. I don't know if you can hear me very well. Immediately after the re-election of President Hassan Rouhani in Iran on May 19th. Also after the Riyadh summit in the 20th and the 21st of May, and after some hacked news posted in the Q&A website in which Iran was mentioned. The hacked posts quoted Qatar Emir statement calling Iran as an Islamic power and criticizing the renewed tensions with Iran. Moreover, the first of the 13 demands included in the list issued by the blockade quartet on the 23rd of June directly addressed Iran by requesting, and I quote, number one, scale down diplomatic ties with Iran and close the Iranian diplomatic missions in Qatar, expel members of the Iran Revolutionary Guard, and cut off military and intelligence cooperations with Iran. I mean, the statement continued criticizing also the trade and commerce with Iran must comply with the US and international sanctions in a manner that does not jeopardize the security of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and close quote. Even though that specific demand disappeared in the following 6 principles list issued on the 19th of July, it is undeniable the important role Iran played as a trigger in the current crisis, regardless of their will in getting involved on it, and despite the fact that no drastic change will affect or is affecting Iran-Qatar's relation at the strategic level. And I will explain a little bit later about that. In my presentation, as the chairman said, I will try to analyze which was the actual role of Iran in the current crisis and to answer the question of whether it was an essential or instrumental factor in the diplomatic rift and imposed blockade. Also, I will try to address the question of what is the Iranian position, which is the Iranian position in face of the Saudi-Qatar confrontation, and which are the benefits Iran is getting from the intra-GCC controversy. The first issue I want to address is that Iran was an instrumental factor in building the accusations of the 4 blockade countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, against Qatar. It has been extensively discussed along these 7 months, the contradictions that those demands represented when requesting Iran to sever ties with Iran, when other GCC states such as Oman and the UAE shared even much better relations with a northern neighbor without being criticized for that. I mean, we always heard about how important is the bilateral trade between mainly Dubai and Iran, and how good relations Iran and Oman are sharing. Moreover, this contradiction is very visible, having in mind the economically strategic importance that the gas oil field represent to Qatari interests. Cutting relations with Iran could have undeniable harm Qatari economy much more than any existing blockade. The fact that the 6 principles did not mention Iran and its second round of demands demonstrated that Qatari-Iranian links in that case were not the main objective of the sanctions, but using Iran as a scapegoat to directly attack Qatar for its independent foreign policy. The second point is that despite the fact that Iranian-Qatari relations were not in the best shape since the Arab Spring, and that Iran shares the Saudi accusation regarding Qatar's sponsorship of some extremist groups in Syria that are fighting against the Iranian-backed Assad regime, the Iranian government sided with Qatar in the current crisis. Clearly, Iran gave priority to the main confrontation with the Saudi kingdom by supporting Qatar, and this has been visible along the 7 months of the crisis so far. On that regard, there were several direct communications between Qatari and Iranian officials in which the Iranian support was explicit and which made possible the improvement of bilateral relations. On the 23rd of August, Qatar announced that its ambassador would be sent back to Tehran with the aspiration to strengthen bilateral relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran in all fields. And this is quoted from the statement from the Foreign Ministry. This announcement happened right after a phone call between both foreign ministries, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani and Mohammed Jabas Zarif. During that conversation, again citing the sources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they discussed bilateral relations and means of boosting and developing them, as well as a number of issues of common concern. On the same month, on 31st of August, the Iranian President Rouhani had a phone call with the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, and expressed Iran's willingness to strengthen bonds among Muslim countries of the region, and expressing that, and quoting, the Islamic Republic of Iran believes that what is being imposed on Qatar is unjust and it leads to more tension among countries of the region. Apart from the declarations on the political level, Iran showed since the very beginning of the crisis in June its readiness to prevent the blockade to affect Qatar, its economy, and mainly its population. Tehran was very quickly established new time slots to facilitate the use of the Iranian airspace to Qatar Airways flights, that they were forced to draw new routes to reach the destination. There is a time frame established of 3 minutes between every plane to cross the Iranian airspace. Through very quickly in the first week of the blockade, Iran allocated or reduced that time to 2 minutes in order to allow more flights to cross the Iranian airspace. And since the very beginning also of the crisis, Iran offered its products, food, dairy products, etc., to cover the ones that stopped to be sent from Saudi Arabia and Emirates. There are a lot of reports about shipments and air cargo bringing different kind of fruits and vegetables and any different dairy products to Qatar. Moreover, since June and July, Iran producers and business delegations visited Doha with the aim to establish more permanent links with the Qatari market. New shipping lines from Bandar Abbas and Bushehr ports were established, and others were deviated from previous destinations in Dubai and Muscat in order to cope with the new Qatari needs. Shirin Asal Food Industrial Group, which is the biggest confectionery company in Iran, also started to modernize some facilities and to adapt them to the Qatari market, with the expectation of having a long-term contract to supply goods to Qatar. According to several reports issued by Iranian financial institutions, the trade between the two countries increased around 117% in the 7 months of the current Iranian fiscal year, which started on the 21st of March, compared with the same period in the last year. The main products exported were food, agricultural products, and bitumen, which is very interesting to point out, showing that there is not only basic products, but products that like cement or bitumen that can be used in the strategic goals or in the strategic plan that Qatar is working for the World Cup. Finally, last week, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar signed a transportation deal for boosting trade among the three countries. This pact would facilitate the transportation of goods from Turkey and also Azerbaijan by land across Iran, which would reduce around 80% of the cost compared with the air cargo, according to the Iranian sources. I couldn't check this with other sources in Qatar. The third and last point of this presentation is that despite the fact that the Qatar Gulf crisis have benefited Iran short term in terms of geopolitical position in the Gulf and the Middle East, and in terms of bilateral relations mainly with Qatar and Turkey, it could negatively affect Iran long term, since the permanent tension within the GCC will increase the risk and threat perceptions along the region, with the possible escalate in the Saudi-Iranian confrontation and the economy being affected not only in Iran, but in the whole region. It is assumed that Iran has long competed for power and influence with other countries in the Middle East, a competition characterized by territorial conflict, cultural differences, as well as, since the late 70s when the Islamic Republic was implemented, ideological contention. In fact, a common element in a large part of the foreign policy analysis literature on Iran is the assumption that the permanent objective of Iran is to become a key player in the region, not just in the Persian Gulf, but also in the greater Middle East and Central Asia. But beyond the actual capabilities of one particular state, in this case Iran, a fundamental element for the categorization of a state as a regional power is the acceptance of its status by the states with which it shares a regional system or subsystem, and as well on the part of the great powers that control or determine the rules of the game in the international system. In the specific Iranian case, this acceptation was not visible until the signature of the nuclear deal JCPOA in 2015. Before that, Iran, and it was mentioned yesterday in one of the tables, Iran was excluded from any regional framework or multilateral dialogue regarding regional security concerns, which prevented Iran normalization with the GCC states, globally and individually, and the rest of the international community. The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani started in 2013 a diplomatic initiative aimed at securing the smaller GCC states the peaceful intention of the Iranian foreign policy. The current crisis gave Iran the chance to tell Qatar and other GCC states, as well as other Arab states like Lebanon, that it is Saudi Arabia and not Iran that threatens the independence and sovereignty of the other Middle East and Gulf states. The crisis is also helping to move Iran from a sectarian narrative, something that was also mentioned yesterday, since Tehran is trying to improve its relation with Doha and Ankara, in spite of the differences they face regarding the Syrian conflict and other regional issues. It is evident that Qatar maintained a very different approach to Iran compared with Saudi Arabia, not only because they share the biggest gas field in the world, but because Qatari authorities never agreed on the threat perception that Iran represents for the Saudi government. This different threat perception started to become very problematic for Qatari-Saudi relations after the Arab Spring, as it was visible in the previous crisis of 2014. Apart from the pressure exerted on the Qatari authorities regarding Muslim Brotherhood support, the message the Saudis wanted to deliver at the Doha summit in December 2014 was clear. The main danger for the whole GCC is, and will be Iran, and all the GCC members should share this view. At the end of the day, we should remind that the main goal for the creation of the GCC in 1981 was the creation of a regional security mechanism to tackle the challenges coming from the recently established Islamic Republic and to support the Iraqi effort of war. To sum up, the developments mentioned along my presentation represented a clear victory for Iran in its Cold War with Saudi Arabia. Instead of succeeding in forcing Qatar to sever relations with Iran, and it was, as it was included in the initial demands, Iran improved not only its relation with Qatar, but also with Turkey, favoring more long-term policies and agreements on bilateral and regional issues, as we have been witnessing in the last few months. The acceptation of Iran as a regional power will not be extended, though, to other countries. Instead, this new situation would reinforce the anti-Iranian position of both Saudi Arabia as well as United States, with Trump at the presidency, it is witnessing a new harsh approach to the nuclear deal, as well as to the perceived negative influence Iran is exerting in the whole region, and this has been visible also in the last few months. To conclude, something that was mentioned by the Saudi foreign minister in Spain 2 weeks ago in a close meeting, he mentioned specifically we have three problems nowadays. I mean, talking about specifically the Gulf crisis, we have three problems now in the region: Iran, and Iran. So this gives you the idea that Iran keeps being the problem, even though the current Iranian situation is becoming much better because of the way in which Iran approached this current situation. Thank you very much.
شكرا.
Thank you, Zaccara, who concentrates on the Iranian role and how to interpret this role out of the pragmatic principle that has been distinguishing the Iranian foreign policy. Not only during the Gulf crisis, Iran is adopting a situation that is for the sake of its strategic benefit, regardless the Qatari situation that opposes what's going on in Yemen or in Syria. The same thing happened in 2003 and in 1991, where Iran has adopted a situation that will achieve its benefits in 91 on Iraq and in 2003 in Iraq as well. Regardless, the Gulf negative situation towards the Iranian-Iraqi war, but in the liberation of Kuwait war, the situation was different, and we need to know that the foreign policy of Iran is quite pragmatic. Now, the second speaker in this session, Murat, he will discuss the Turkish role in this Gulf crisis and the Turkish role as well that is and was present even before the crisis, and that might go on after the crisis, as Turkey has its ambitions, like the ambitions of Iran, to be a main player in the situation in the Gulf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you very much for inviting to this conference. In my speech, I will try to answer two questions. The first one is the question of what is the strategic rationality behind Turkey's policy towards the Gulf crisis. And second one is the question of what will be the implications of Turkey-Qatar, so to speak, alliance on the post-Arab Spring reformulation of regional geopolitics. Before explain the questions that I mentioned, first of all, I would like to touch upon Turkey's early reactions in order to give you some sort of background. The first one, Turkish Parliament ratified military deals allowing its troops to be deployed to Turkish military base in Qatar. Secondly, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, told that this move, sending Turkey's troops to the Qatar, is contributing to the security of the Arab Gulf region, and it's not aimed at any specific Gulf state. Thirdly, Turkey embraced a moderate position towards Saudi Arabia and tried to play the role of mediator to overcome the crisis without jeopardizing its strong relations with Saudi Arabia. And fourth, the policymakers in Ankara thought that Turkey would recalibrate its foreign policy and play its pre-Arab Spring role in the region in the case of Gulf crisis. So against this background, I would like to raise two level of analysis in order to explain the question that I mentioned before. The first level is domestic level, which is important to my understanding in shaping Turkish foreign policy towards the Gulf crisis. Firstly, Turkey perceived the crisis not the viewpoint of the intra-Gulf power politics competition. Rather, Turkey understood crisis a geopolitical attempt to reformulate of post-Arab Spring regional order, in which I think Turkey also sees itself as one of the target countries in the process of remapping of Middle East. And the Turkish way of seeing the new Gulf crisis is heavily shaped by its experience of the Arab Spring, in which the balance between diplomatic and military means is vital and inseparable. In terms of the domestic level, Turkey's reaction was also shaped by general public discourse. Qatar, I think, has a very strong image in Turkish society, and Turkey has a very strong image in Qatari society. Especially the nature of Saudi Arabia-led coalition was really important in shaping Turkish people perception towards the crisis. First, the image of the countries within the Turkish society was not good. I mean, the perception towards the Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and other coalition members during the crisis. And secondly, the claims about Qatar, such as so-called support of terrorism and the naive political demands from Qatar, were highly problematic for the society. On the other hand, the 15 July military coup attempt in Turkey and Qatar's open support to Turkey in that time were also important in shaping public reaction against the crisis. So therefore, I think we should take into consideration domestic level in terms of the perception of the people was really important in order to understand first the Turkey's reaction towards the crisis. The second level that I want to raise as a critical, level to understand Turkey's position, I think there are many, the reason driving forces behind the Turkey's reaction towards the Gulf crisis. The first one is the common normative perspective towards the Arab Spring between Turkey and Qatar, which was really important driving forces behind Turkish foreign policy. Firstly, both countries share similar views regarding the Arab Spring. Within the context of normative and political commitments to the domestic popular civilian mobilization across the region, Turkey and Qatar support the foundational values of Arab Spring, while Turkey and Qatar are promoting moderate change in the region. It is not wrong to say that many of the remaining countries in the region are working to maintain status quo in the regional politics. The divergent perspective over the role of political movements such as Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas became one of the main aspects of confrontation between Turkey and Qatar on the one hand and the other regional powers on the other. For example, the Egyptian military coup in Egypt against Morsi in 2013 was a striking example showing how Turkey and Qatar supported different sides while the others backed Sisi. The normative, I think, example in terms of understanding the commonalities between Qatar and Turkey is not limited to Egypt. The two countries' framing of Libya, Syria, and Tunisia also represent their difference from the other major Gulf countries, though they are geopolitically in the same camp, especially against Iran in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The second one is the common strategic interest between Qatar and Turkey was really vital in shaping Turkey's strategic mentality towards the crisis. The two countries have almost the same perspective regarding security issues in the region. For example, during the recent visit of President Erdogan, he emphasized the importance of Turkey-Qatar relation by saying that Qatar has always been, especially in the recent difficult times, a strong friend of Turkey. With Qatar, we look at all regional problems from the same window. The third one in the regional level is the military-industrial complex. I think Turkey is aware that Qatar is interested in diversifying its defense and security procurements. Turkey and Qatar have opted for closer relations in defense and security because they face similar security dilemmas. Therefore, the military-industrial complex through which both countries want to improve their capacity represent the strategic aspect of the relationship. Turkey's decision to send troops and setting up a military base in Qatar have become even more important during the crisis. Although Turkey maintains a balanced view towards the crisis, its position has been shaped by two important variables: The first one is that Ankara sent out a very strong message that Qatar was not alone in the ideological and geopolitical struggle amongst the Arab countries, especially within the context of intra-GCC struggle. At the same time, it showed, sending the military troops, that Ankara could play the role of external balancer in de-escalating the crisis. In the case of the possibility of the militarization of the crisis, I think Ankara has also shown that it can take a military action alongside Qatar. Thus, Turkey hopes that it will consolidate and operationalize its position during the crisis in favor of Qatar by sending its military troops to Qatar. On the other hand, it has not opted to take a position against Saudi Arabia. Ankara took a great risk with this move, of course, although it is not yet clear how the leading, figure or security establishment within the power structure of Saudi Arabia will respond to Turkey's action during the crisis. It is, I think, possible to say that Saudi Arabia will not want to lose Turkey in the period when the Iranian threat is so serious for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. At the end of the day, the Gulf crisis has shown that both Turkey and Qatar should reconsider their strategies under the circumstances of radical external pressure. It also represents Turkey's increasing military activism in the region. For example, the Operation Euphrates Shield, Turkey's military presence in Iraq, and Turkey's ongoing military activism operation in Syria are the example of these kinds of military activism, how Turkey is trying to recalibrate its foreign policy in the region, especially in the post-15 July military coup attempt in Turkey. So the other dimension is also a part of this military activism, which is the power projection strategy of Turkey. Qatar is not the only country that Turkey has military base. Turkey has also the military base in Somalia. So therefore, the power projection of is the new aspect of Turkey's new foreign policy, I think, in the post-15 July military coup attempt. The fourth dimension is the economic cooperation between two countries were vital in shaping Turkey's strategy vis-à-vis the Gulf crisis. In terms of foreign direct investments between 2003 and 2017, Turkey ranked as Qatar's 19th largest investor. So the perception of Qatar in Turkey in terms of its involvement in economic sector in Turkey is really important. It is not probably representing the structural dimensions of Turkish economy, but in terms of the shape, the psychology of economy in Turkey, Qatar is playing a really critical role in Turkish economy. The last one, I think, in order to understand Turkey's strategic rationality towards the crisis is the so to speak, role of United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is perceived Turkey as one of the hostile country, not in the case of the crisis, but in the case of the wider other geopolitical issues, such as, United Arab Emirates engagement with the Libyan crisis, Syria, and the increasing, anti-Turkey discourse in DC, for example. The United States, Turkey, and many believes in Turkey, United Arab Emirates is playing a vital role in shaping anti-Turkey discourse. And when we look at the other cases, for example, the Somalia, Qatar is also perceived a threat for Turkey. Therefore, I think these five reasons shape Turkey's strategic rationality towards the Gulf crisis. And we can also understand why Turkey is trying to improve its military relations with the Qatar during and after the crisis. So the second question that I mentioned before what would be the implication for the regional geopolitics. I think, first of all, the Gulf crisis articulating around the competing narratives of the major regional actors on the post-Arab Spring regional orders has reproved the fragility of the regional security architecture, particularly in the Gulf sub-region. For Qatar, as a lessons learned, the crisis has shown the limits of the autonomy and strategic fragility of the small countries in a very hostile region. It has also shown that the strategy of diversification in international affairs is vital in balancing external political pressure. For Turkey, on the other hand, the regional geopolitical picture in the post-Arab Spring era is very dynamic and unstable and cannot be handled by simply maintaining a one-dimensional foreign and security policy. The conventionally all system does not mean that all countries have the same strategic vision in deterring threats. At this stage, if the new Gulf crisis turns out to be a struggle between Turkey and Qatar on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on the other, then the regional geopolitics will be more fragmented in the near future. More importantly, the Gulf crisis will influence the future of GCC, as it was mentioned yesterday's panel, at least in the short and medium term, and raise the question about the capacity and credibility of the Council vis-à-vis the Iranian penetration in the region. So, and in order to understand Turkey's strategy, I think in terms of the relationship between Qatar and Turkey and its effect on the regional implication, we have to answer many questions, and there are many unknowns regarding the future of region. For example, what will be the strategy of Turkey for the post-Arab Spring regional order, and particularly the question of how Turkey can recalibrate its foreign policy post-ISIS, Iraq, and Syria, I think are really important. I think for me, there are many questions with regards to Turkey's position. First of all, the relationship between Turkey and United States is really important dimensions to understand how Turkey will maintain its policies in the Gulf region. As you know, the terrorism, I mean the PYD and PKK issue is one of the vital and game changer issue between Turkey and United States. If United States will maintain its support to PKK in the Syria in the post-ISIS era, I think this will be very problematic for Turkey's involvement into the regional issues. Of course, there are many other issues in Turkey-U.S. relations, such as the coup attempt in Turkey, and the perpetrator of the coup attempt, Gülenist movement, is listed Turkey as a terrorist organization. So this will be an important indicator to shape the future of the Turkey-U.S. relations, and I think it will impact also Turkey's regional policies. The second one is the question of the increasing rapprochement between Russia and Turkey, especially in the military domains. Of course, Syria is one of the important and strategically, has potential to shape Turkey's, future policies towards the region, including the Gulf region. And there is some sort of consensus, or if you like, the agreement between Turkey, Iran, and Russia over the future of Syria, in which United States has different perspective vis-a-vis those three countries. Of course, the S-400 deal between Turkey and Russia will be one of the important dimensions of the Turkey-Russian relations and Turkey-U.S. relations. Of course, United States at this stage will not lose Turkey in this military domain. It is also a symbolic meaning for Russia in terms of influencing a NATO member by selling its military product for not NATO countries. So therefore, under the circumstance of Turkey's emerging threat, if Turkey, change its modality with Russia, then will also influence Turkey's policy and strategy in the region. The last one, I think, is the question of how will be the implications of the new increasing relationship between Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, especially in the post-KRG referendum. There are increasing, common understanding between Iraq, Iran, and Turkey towards the Kurdish issue in the whole region. And of course, the PKK is one of the important dimensions of this trilateral strategic relationship. I think last week, the case in the history of these three countries' relations was really important, that Iran and Iraq, shared an intelligence for Turkey about PKK. I think this is a very symbolic cooperation between three countries. So all these question, I think we need to clearly answer. Then we can clearly say that Turkey's strategy in the region will be shaped. Okay, thank you so much. Was some sort of sign for me that you
شكرا لمراد على
Thank you, Murat, very much for your presentation. It is a valuable presentation. Thank you for being committed to the 20-minute allocated for every speaker. He spoke about the Turkish strategy. It's an ambitious strategy that aims to have Turkey as a main player in the security in the Gulf, despite all the obstacles that can hinder Turkey from achieving this goal. On top of these problems, the competition between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and there are other parties in the region like Iran that might not be willing to pave the way for Turkey to be a main party. Also, we have something that we will discuss it later. Turkey is... We'll move now to the final speaker in this session, Zahid Shahab Ahmed. He will talk to us about the Pakistani role in this Gulf crisis. And matter of fact, the Pakistani situation needs a lot of analysis in order to understand. Before the Gulf crisis, also Pakistan has adopted partial situation regarding the war in Yemen. Pakistan hasn't participated in the coalition, and then Pakistan has been also partial regarding the Gulf crisis. Probably this might not be accepted by Saudi Arabia, putting in mind the strategic relations between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Zahid will talk about the Pakistani situation and will try to interpret and analyze the motives behind this situation. Zahid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the Arab Center for the invitation to speak on a very important subject, which is, Pakistan's foreign policy and Pakistan's position on the Qatar Gulf crisis. Last time I came a couple of years ago at the Gulf Studies Forum, I presented on Pakistan's position on the crisis in the Yemen and why Pakistan had actually initially refused to join and ultimately was bullied into joining the Saudi-led military coalition in some ways. What is different from Iran's position is that Pakistan has not taken a very clear side in the Qatar Gulf crisis, and I'll get to the analysis of that. And similar to the case of Turkey, Pakistan's foreign policy is now adjusting into this global geostrategic environment in which poles are shifting. So Pakistan is also, similar to the case of Turkey, is more keen for relations with Russia. And interestingly, in my previous job, I had hosted as the head of the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies the first, Russian military delegation in Islamabad as well. So since then, there has been a lot of progress, military exercises as well between Pakistan and Russia. And considering also one needs to look at Pakistan's foreign policy in the regional sort of sphere in South Asia as well, where India is the next door very big neighbor, but at the same time a very big enemy. And India's long-term policy of isolating Pakistan, and that has also shaped Pakistan's foreign policy in certain ways. So keywords of Pakistan's foreign policy for the past 2-3 years have been balanced relations, neutrality, and of course, it continues to maintain these, both of these aspects. But these are evident through also Pakistan calling, for instance, Chabahar port in Iran as a sister port of Gwadar in Pakistan. So that, in a way, gives just one example from the outside in relation to Pakistan's changing foreign policy and the relations with not only GCC countries but interest in close relations with Iran as well, because it shares a border with Iran. So why it is important to know Pakistan's perspective on the Gulf crisis? First of all, it is the second biggest Muslim country in terms of the population, with a very strong army. And in fact, in the top 10, the only nuclear power among the Muslim world, and plays a very important role within the OIC, at the UN, and also has very, very strong relations with all of the GCC countries, whether economic, defense, strategic, and cultural as well. So I'll try and very quickly, go through all these aspects, because I don't have to, I think, repeat myself in talking about how good the relations are with all the, stakeholders involved in the conflict. But I think it's important to begin by talking about the role of identity in Pakistan's foreign policy. So Pakistan is by design a Muslim majority country. Since 1947, it was created for the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent, and since then the role of religion is very important. So I quote here, from the Constitution of Pakistan, that says that the state shall endeavor to preserve and strengthen fraternal relations among Muslim countries based on Islamic unity. So this has been the key principle of Pakistan's foreign policy. Of course, just like other countries, not all countries follow their principles written in the constitution very closely, but I think that is how Pakistan's diplomats are trained. They're trained to maintain more closer relations with the Muslim countries, and that played a very significant role in what I'll talk about later on as well, because this speaks for itself about the country's identity and closeness with all the stakeholders in the Qatar Gulf crisis. So one aspect is very important, the increasing interdependence between all the GCC countries and Pakistan. On the surface of it, it may look like Pakistan receives a lot of money from all GCC countries, receives a lot of aid. In fact, Pakistan is number one in terms of GCC countries' humanitarian assistance to any country. Okay, so it's number one with $500 million in the past 10 years to Pakistan from all the GCC countries. But there's the other side, which is also the dependence of GCC countries on defense relations with Pakistan, strategic relations with Pakistan, and another interesting aspect is, some of the GCC countries, especially Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, having very strong relations with political elites in Pakistan, and that is often very less analyzed in relation to how strong the relations are. And another important aspect is of Pakistan's skilled workforce in all these countries, and how much in return, of course, Pakistan receives remittances from all of these countries. So from Saudi Arabia, it receives $4.5 billion per annum in remittances. From Qatar, interestingly, and this aspect I would also later on analyze as well, that although the level of relationship with Qatar is not as high as relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's very interesting that Pakistan decided to maintain neutrality. It was almost like, Soon after 9/11, when George Bush asked Pakistan, either you are with us or against us. And so Pakistan was also asked by Saudi Arabia, by King Salman, in fact, asked Pakistani Prime Minister whether he was actually with them or against them. And it was very interesting that Pakistan ultimately decided on the neutrality. So now I'll quickly go through the level of relationship that Pakistan has with, let's say, Saudi Arabia. It doesn't need much of revelation that there are very strong relations because of the cultural connection, which, so for instance, close to 200,000 Pakistanis go for Hajj every year. More than 500,000 Pakistanis go to perform Umrah. And then all Saudi kings have been to Pakistan, and our Pakistani leadership visits very regularly Saudi Arabia, especially the military leaders. They visit Saudi Arabia very regularly, which is an interesting aspect of the defense relations between both countries. And during the time after 9/11, when Pakistan was, its economy was in deep crisis, Saudi Arabia gave a lot of money to rescue Pakistan and under difficult circumstances. So that's very important. And its role in Pakistan's domestic affairs is more visible now than ever before. So there's cultural influence. So unlike maybe any country in the world, we have two Saudis heading the Islamic University in Islamabad, who only speak Arabic, which is and also interesting dimension. So there's what I'm trying to say, that there is a very, very strong Saudi cultural presence in Pakistan, and close to 15,000 Pakistani soldiers are in Saudi Arabia for various purposes, for training purposes, and to maintain the relationship. And in fact, Pakistan's army chief was recently in Saudi Arabia and UAE to further strengthen the relationships. Another aspect of defense relations, and why for Pakistan Army, GCC countries are so important, because Pakistan exports its weapons also to all of these GCC countries. And although initially Pakistan refused to join the so-called Islamic Military Alliance to fight terrorism in Yemen, that's how it is labeled now, its title, and its parliament gave a very clear decision that they were not going to participate in this war against Yemen, because Pakistan, perhaps you would know, that has a very significant Shia population. But if you look at it in terms of numbers, it is the second biggest Shia country. Okay, because a country of 207 million people, and of that, looking at 15% of the population is a Shia population. So it created a very difficult sort of situation for the parliament to take any side, and ultimately the decision was made not to participate in the coalition. But what happened, and that is a very clever decision as well, that Pakistan's former army chief now heads the Saudi-led military coalition, and that's because they wanted to have an insider there. I spoke to some journals in Pakistan recently, and they said they wanted to have an insider to know what's going on. So that was Pakistan's interest, very interesting aspect. And now moving on to the UAE. UAE is Pakistan's biggest trade partner in the GCC. Close to 1.2 million Pakistanis work in the UAE, which is also a very significant aspect. But relations became very uncomfortable when Pakistan's parliament said no for the very first time to any of the GCC countries. And so there was a lot of bullying from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, especially the media in the UAE wrote so many bad things about Pakistan. For example, Pakistan betraying GCC countries and so on. So I'm politely using the language, but the language was much harsher than what I would like to express here in my talk. And this led to slowly relationship moving into that uncomfortable sort of territory in which Pakistan actually refused to give the control of Gwadar port to Dubai because of concerns on conflict of interest, because Gwadar is so close to Dubai, and so there are other aspects of bilateral relations as well. Relations with Bahrain have been also very important. One of the stakeholders in the Qatar Gulf crisis. Pakistan has very strong defense relations. The King of Bahrain visited Pakistan, and especially visited Pakistan's military headquarters. And that shows, the kind of relationship we have with Bahrain. And close to 100,000 Pakistanis work in Bahrain as well. So now moving on to Qatar. So, considering the level of relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, why Pakistan said no to Saudi Arabia on the issue of Qatar Gulf crisis, could have easily said yes, considering there's less dependence on Qatar. But there the issue of domestic politics comes into play, because this whole incident happened at a time when Pakistan's then Prime Minister was going through all the corruption charges under Panama Gate scandal, and Qatari, not only the government, but one of the Qatari members of the Qatari royal family, he was all behind Nawaz Sharif, then the president, to rescue him through the crisis, and sent a couple of letters as well to the Supreme Court of Pakistan to rescue him. That didn't work, but that shows that Nawaz Sharif has his own, personal conflict of interest in maintaining neutrality in this conflict, because of equal relations with the Saudis and also with the Qataris. And in the past few years, the level of economic cooperation between Qatar and Pakistan has increased. As an energy deficient country with a very large population, Pakistan is dependent on energy resources. So there is now, Pakistan imports 3.7 million tons of LNG from Qatar every year. And there are close to 100,000 Pakistani workers here as well. Qatari royal family has very close relations with Pakistan. And now I move on to some very important aspects regarding Pakistan's response on the Qatar Gulf crisis. I've already talked about how it was very difficult to say no to Saudi Arabia in terms of the war in Yemen. And saying no the second time was easier than before. Okay, because it wasn't the first time. So Pakistan said no the second time by also very cleverly playing with the whole issue. So Pakistani diplomats, they read, all the news very quickly, and before being asked, they offered to mediate. And I was discussing with Mr. Chair earlier that, why Pakistan's offer of mediation wasn't accepted very warmly, because it's a non-Arab country and lacks that sort of legitimacy to play a very important role of a mediator in the Arab environment. So, but of course, there was that position which is there in the Constitution of Pakistan as well, to help resolve conflicts peacefully. And there is, Pakistani diplomats have, some experience of being engaged in track 2 diplomacy and track 1 diplomacy as well. And for the past couple of years, the public opinion in Pakistan has also shifted. It's really interesting to see so many newspapers, scholars, and you have, analysts from think tanks now openly saying things against Saudi Arabia. And this has something to do with the level of bullying that Pakistan has, faced over the years from countries from which Pakistan receives a lot of money. But as I mentioned, the level of interdependence has grown, but it's not to that extent where Pakistan can openly, present its position like, let's say, Iran. Iran has its own, different dimensions of the foreign policy. And another aspect I wanted to highlight is how Pakistani diplomats, preempted and because of the domestic politics ultimately decided to maintain neutrality. And there is another aspect of Pakistan's foreign policy now, that in the past 2 years or 2 to 3 years, Pakistan has received close to $60 billion of Chinese investment. And that also shows that Pakistan is now, the way its thinking is shaped is now less economically dependent, you can say, on the stakeholders involved in the Qatar Gulf crisis. And that played its own very important role, because with China, and if Pakistan has to completely materialize the benefits from Chinese investment in Pakistan, or benefit from Gwadar and all the trade connecting with Central Asia, that's the big purpose of reviving this Silk Route, then of course relations with Iran are very important. although the relationship with Iran has been very difficult. Earlier this year, Iranian drone was shot down and on Pakistani side. Pakistan has serious concerns on Indian intelligence using Iranian soil to support Baloch insurgency and terrorism in Pakistan. And according to some of the recent reports from Pakistan's military, that Indian intelligence has a budget of more than 500 million to work against the Chinese investment in Pakistan. So they're competing interests. But as I mentioned, like the narrative of or the discourse of Pakistan's foreign policy has changed. It's more in favor of neutrality. So for instance, as I mentioned in the beginning, Chabahar port is called a sister port of Gwadar. So that in a way speaks for itself. And interestingly, soon after the Qatar Gulf crisis, stakeholders or key leaders from all the stakeholder countries, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, they have been regular visitors to Pakistan. They know Pakistan's importance in the whole crisis, and especially Qatari foreign officials have been to Pakistan. Qatar's foreign minister, in July he was in Islamabad. He engaged in a dialogue with Pakistani leadership, and in a way, perhaps underlying aspect of that engagement was to appreciate Pakistan's neutrality. So although like on the surface of it, it would look like Pakistan didn't take any side, but for Qataris, it meant a lot. It meant that Pakistan supported Qatar on this issue, because saying no to Saudi Arabia and the UAE wasn't an easy thing, or saying that we can't be with you, and in terms of the crisis. And I think I would perhaps conclude here by saying that. And another aspect which I didn't highlight much in my paper, of course, is the dimension Pakistan's relations with Turkey. And that play a very important role, because the Sharif family in Pakistan has a very close alliance with Erdogan, and is engaged in dialogues on a whole range of issues. That's one of the dimensions I have excluded in the paper. But in conclusion, I would say that it is by good luck and good crisis management that Pakistan has treaded very difficult diplomatic crisis. It was almost like a situation of a fight between two brothers, and Pakistan trying to decide which side to take. But ultimately, I think the level of neutrality that they maintain has helped Pakistan gain a lot of confidence in terms of its foreign policy. And that has also helped Pakistan and Qatar move on to the next level of relationship. The trade between Pakistan and Qatar has increased ever since. There are more shipments, between both countries, and that shows that Pakistan has achieved, something very important. And another aspect, in conclusion, I would like to say that Islamabad's ability, the capital of Pakistan, or diplomats there, their ability of preempting the possibility of demands on one-sided approach in the crisis also helped a lot, because they preempted and very cleverly played the card of acting the mediator, which wasn't accepted, but of course, it helped a lot in showing Pakistan's, new aspects of Pakistan's foreign policy, in which Pakistan has now new geostrategic interests and new global interests, and continues to now move towards, more approaches that can counter India's approach of isolating Pakistan, not only in South Asia, but elsewhere. So thank you. I will conclude.
Thank you, Zahid. شكرا للأخ
Thank you, Zahid.
تطرق إلى تفسير
Zahid
الموقف الباكستاني والحقيقة بأن
dealt with the Pakistani situation. The Pakistani situation is different, as mentioned by Zahid, and it was for the first time, even before the intervention in Yemen, representing a difference in the Pakistani foreign policy. And regardless the interpretations of the Pakistani situation that represent a personal attitude for some Pakistani politician, for the Pakistani president, also he dealt with the depend of the Gulf countries of Pakistan when it comes to the military support and equipment. Also, the extremists in Pakistan and extremism in Pakistan and the inability of these extremist organizations of Pakistan to reach the Gulf area. So the Gulf countries need Pakistan and need to cooperate with Pakistan to fight terrorism and extremism. Now we have some time for some discussion, and I hope the participants will abide themselves by the time limit as done by the speakers, 20 minutes for every speaker. Now we will open the floor for some discussions, and this will go only for 30 minutes. 30 minutes is the maximum time for the discussion, and everyone has only 3 minutes. And to comment also, we need not very lengthy comment from the speakers. We need things to go on this way. Thank you. The name, please.
Okay. Hope you can hear me. Mohammed Sharqawi from George Mason University. I have a question to Mr. Murad, who spoke about Turkey's strategy towards the Gulf crisis. Apparently, one of the ironies of this Gulf crisis is that it has emerged in the backdrop of a regional Cold War between Saudi Arabia on one hand and Iran on the other hand, while we sort of walked away from the classical Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. So my question is, how does Turkey handle this Cold War while it is trying to establish good relationships with the Saudis, with the Iranians? Now it is part of this new Warsaw Pact, Russia, Iran, Turkey. At the same time, when we look at the undercurrents of this crisis for the last 6 months, it has helped the Qataris, but at the same time, it has not turned against their rivals. So is this a moderate, a new strategy within the Turkish strategy? Thank you.
Short answer. Okay, the question. I think Turkey is, separating its foreign policy towards Iran than its foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia. In terms of the regional dimensions of Turkish foreign policy, Turkey is also, perceiving Iran as a threat. I mean, in terms of increasing its geopolitical expansions towards the Syria and Iraq. So therefore, Turkey and Saudi Arabia can understand each other in terms of the rising Iranian influence in the region. On the other hand, Turkey has a good relationship, bilateral relationship with Iran, because Turkey, there are many issues that Iran and Turkey needs to be cooperated in the region. Especially the Iraq is one of the important theater for Iran and Turkey in terms of the increasing rise of the PKK in the region. So economically, Turkey and Iran, are cooperating, and Turkey is trying to improve its economic relations from the trade volume from number $10 billion to the $30 billion, which is really important for Turkey. So in terms of your question about the Cold War, of course, Turkey, want to see the stable and secure regional order, that which Turkey does not want to see any conflict between these two big powers.
Deliberate balance of power?
Yeah, deliberate balance of power between these two countries. I think because Turkey sees that Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey are the main regional players in terms of creating a stable regional order in the Middle East.
Yeah, thanks very much. In fact, to all three speakers, I learned an enormous amount, especially also about Pakistan more than anything. But I just had a question of clarification or puzzlement on the Turkish case on two things. One, you said one of the explanations for the closeness is commercial relations, investment relations. But then you said Qatar is the 19th largest, I think, 19th largest partner. I mean, that's not normally something I would tick as important, or even I'd probably tick it as hardly relevant. So I'm just puzzled why you put it out there as important. On the Turkish decision to put troops here and a base, symbolically, I can see that was very important. It's almost as if it's some kind of tripwire. It's a symbolic statement. But I just wonder whether you could say something about whether it means anything beyond that. Because one of the things that seems striking is, I don't know, maybe it's simply because I'm badly informed, but I don't know of any preparations or even discussions among the Turkish military establishment about what would happen in order to give effect to more significant support. If the tripwire were tripped, there doesn't seem to be any preparation on the Turkish end to give effect to what then would need to happen. So that makes me wonder, and I wonder if we could elucidate a bit.
For your question, I think in terms of the economy, compared to the, Turkish GDP, Qatar's, presence in Turkish economy is not too much. I mean, but as I mentioned in my presentation, it's a psychological effect in Turkish economy. When we take into consideration the political crisis between Turkey and the Western countries, the support of Qatar, economic support is Qatar is really important over the people psychology and of course the market. So therefore, I take into consideration the commercial relationship between Turkey and Qatar is really important. The second question, I think, when we look at the Turkish security establishments in terms of how Turkey will use its military troops, again, what kind of threats? As I mentioned before, the Turkish government at least believes that Turkey is not aiming any regional states. Of course, when we look at the parliamentary agreements between Qatar and Turkey, Turkey is going to train the Qatari military forces in Qatar. But I don't think so that Turkey is going to take a military action in the case of any other, military action against Qatar, because it is not operational ability in terms of Turkey's military existence, in terms of numbers and in terms of, military strategy in Qatar.
شكرا جزيلا عبد الوهاب القصاب المركز العربي.
عبد الوهاب القصاب from the Arabic Center. I'd like to comment on Dr. Murad's speech about Turkey and the crisis. We have so many questions. I'm not quite in agreement with some of what he has said. Turkey doesn't see Iran as a threat. As an analyst, and any analyst on the priorities of the foreign Iranian policies has to know that Iran, in all its maneuvers and plans in the area, is trying to attract the minorities, particularly the Shiite minorities, despite the differences between these minorities and Iran. Look to the Alawists in Syria. There is a difference between, also if you go to the Zahid. Now my question is, in Turkey we have also Alawites. It's not small, and historically it is biased towards anything against the Erdogan ruling party. Don't you think there is a term between Iran and Turkey, particularly in this period, being very pragmatic politically countries, or is there any diversion when it comes to the Turkish thoughts about the Alawists in Turkey? What do you think?
I think we can define the relationship between Turkey and Iran as pragmatic relations. It does not necessarily mean that Turkey does not perceive Iran as a threat. As I mentioned in my speech, there are many dimensions, of course, why for Turkey's foreign policy, why Turkey, define Iran as a threat as well as its main, regional partner vis-a-vis the different security issues. There is, I think, a formula to understand the relationship between Iran and Turkey, that if the threat is common, then the cooperation is possible. If the threat is not common, that there is some sort of divergence emerge in the Iranian Turkey relations. So when we look at the Syria and Iraq, that in which we can understand Turkey's position against Iran. In Syria, Turkey sees Iran is one of the main driving reasons behind the Syrian crisis into the civil war. On the other hand, the Iraq, of course, is one of the important geopolitical landscape, geopolitical zone for Turkey and Iran in terms of how these two countries are competing against each other. So therefore, in terms of the Alevi population in Turkey, of course, the Alevis do not support Turkey's position vis-a-vis Syria. But on the other hand, it does not necessarily mean that they are a supporter of Iranian influence in the region. Because it's not comparable with the Shia population or the Shia understanding of religion in the region when compared to the Alevi understanding of religion in Turkey. So we have to separate their understanding of Islam than the Iranian understanding of Iran.
يعني أنا أتمنى أن يكون تنويع في الأسئلة التركيز واضح.
Please make your questions verified, not only focusing on the Turkish speaker. If you have any questions to the Pakistani or Iranian speakers, please go ahead.
Yeah. I have one question to both.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have one question to Mr. Yesiltas and Mr. Luciano, and one question to Mr. Ahmed. First question, shared question to you. So as a follow-up to what you said, Mr. Yesiltas, my question is how Turkish and Iranian standing in Syria, in post-war Syria, would affect their relations with the Gulf countries. As you know, in Sochi we had these trilateral meetings of President Putin, President Rouhani, and President Erdogan, and this meeting was compared by some analysts as a sort of analog of Yalta Conference of 1945. But we know that while they are struggling to come as a triangle, this is marriage of convenience, and both countries have their hidden agenda in Syria. So Iranians want Assad to stay forever. President Erdogan sees no future for Syria with Assad. Putin is trying to balance between them. So how this will, post-Syria war gamble would affect their relations with the Gulf. And the question to Mr. Ahmed, you mentioned briefly Russia. There's a perception in part of Russian military and political elite that when we talk about Pakistan, Pakistan is not a power which is restricted to Southern Asia, that Pakistan holds the keys to strategic regions like Middle East and Syria also. Specifically that by developing relations with Pakistan, Russia would be able to solve its problems in other areas, and that's why Russia is trying to distance itself from India today. So how relevant are those statements? What can be the role of Pakistan in Syrian fight and ISIL in those areas where Russia is desperate for allies? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the Sochi meeting was a turning point in the history of the Syrian civil war. Of course, as you mentioned, you are right. I agree with you that Turkey and Iran have different, agenda in terms of the future of the Syria. But at least the Sochi meeting, I think, represented that, those three countries, came to conclusion that you cannot militarily win this war. So I think as a second step, as a continuation of the Sochi meeting, I think those three countries, cooperation and consensus will be, influencing on the Geneva meeting in the near future. Of course, while Russia wants to, maintain its military gain in the Syria, I think the position or the status of Assad is some sort of detail for Russia. For Iran, I think first of all, Iran want to, support the Assad regime stay in power, and maintain its gain, territorial and the non-state military actors' influence, especially the Shia militias in the region. So Turkey, of course, first of all, is aiming to protect Syrian territorial integrity by, deterring the PKK's influence. So therefore, Turkey's main reaction will be shaped by the dimensions of the PKK. How, for example, United States will continue its relations with these organizations, and how PKK will be playing a role in the future of Syria. I mean, in terms of the supporting territorial integrity of Syria. I think we have to wait, to see the consequence of this Sochi summit in the international society. Then we can analyze how this will be, affect the Gulf crisis or the Gulf region.
Thank you for the question. These are very interesting times for Pakistan and the Pakistani security establishment, and also the foreign policy experts, as far as Russia's concerns of using Pakistan as a springboard for connections with the Middle East or gaining support in Syria. I don't think so we have to go that far, because they have, for the timing, a very common interest in Afghanistan. So there is a quadrilateral peace process between Moscow, Beijing, Islamabad, and Kabul. Most of these dialogues do not include the US, which is a very key player in Afghanistan. And of course, that sends a very clear message, because that they want to take control of the affairs in Afghanistan. And I think the common interest in Afghanistan is to find a win-win solution. So for Pakistan, win solution would be to get a pro-Pakistan regime in Kabul whenever the international troops completely leave. And for Russia also, and for China also, they're looking for more stability in Afghanistan for, of course, various purposes. And now I hope that that Pakistan is now a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. And that is another example of closeness to Moscow and Beijing, of course, for different reasons. And so in my opinion, the closeness between Russia and Pakistan can more be justified by the strategic interests, common strategic interests in South Asia than actually elsewhere in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question to Dr. Murad. The presence of Turkish troops in Qatar, do you think that this troops' presence is related to the Qatari Gulf crisis, or is it a long-term policy? The other question, do you think that the presence of the Turkish forces or having a Turkish base in one of the GCC countries will be the beginning of having other bases in other countries of the GCC? And the last thing, is there any sensitivity regarding the United States for having a Turkish base in one of the GCC countries, because this region should be under control?
Yes, I think it's a long-term strategy for Turkey, because Turkey, experienced from the Arab Spring that I think we need to first of all look at the Turkish foreign policy in the pre-Arab Spring period. Of course, Turkey believed that soft power was really important in order to improve Turkey relation with the other regional countries, especially the Arab countries. But Arab, Spring, especially the Syrian crisis, showed that the soft power and diplomacy, cannot be only tool in calibrating Turkish foreign policy in the region. In order to recalibrate Turkish foreign policy, the military dimensions, I think, became one of the important dimensions for Turkish foreign policy, especially in the post-15 July military coup. So therefore, Turkey's long-term strategy, I don't, want to argue that the Turkish foreign policy is, began to militarize in the region. No, I'm not talking about it. But the Turkey, understood that military tool is really important for its foreign policy. So therefore, the Turkey's, presence in Qatar and other regions, I think, will become a long-term strategy for Turkey. It does not necessarily mean Turkey will militarily react in the case of the crisis, for example, Qatar and other region, but it will, contribute Turkish diplomacy in the region.
And does this Turkish foreign policy contradict with the U.S. foreign policy?
Of course, there are many, contradiction in Turkish foreign policy regarding its strategy towards the United States, but there are also some convergence between Turkey and United States. But the problem is not about the Turkish foreign policy. I think the problem is about how the United States, will shape its general strategy towards the Middle East. When we look at the Trump administration, there is no cohesion, under the Trump administration. Trump, White House is saying something and Pentagon is saying different things. So there is no, comprehensive common institutional strategy. And the Turkey, I think, is one of the striking example how the, current United States administration is perceived differently when the issue comes to the Turkey. For example, Trump was saying that United States will not, support PYD or PKK in the region militarily. On the other hand, Pentagon just one day after Trump's, mention about Turkey, that United States will continue to support PYD in the region. So therefore, first of all, United States foreign policy, I think we need to see how United States foreign policy will be shaped in the near future.
Yes, thank you very much for all these presentations. Just about Alawis in Turkey, I think that we have to distinguish between two communities. That's to say, the Alawite, who are mainly based in Hatay and are in the continuity of the Syrian Alawite, and the Alevi in the eastern part of Turkey, who are quite different. It's another evidence that religious references are not so working and don't necessarily imply the same results. And something very interesting about the Alawite in Hatay is that they are quite neutral and they don't support the Bashar al-Assad power. And they find a kind of refuge in the esotericism. Esotericism is a way for escaping from political debate. But from that, my question would be, how do you appreciate the role of the new political ideology and political orientation of AKP for choosing and elaborating a specific foreign policy and arbitration inside the Middle East? That's to say, how this religion-oriented ideology is able to opt between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar on the ideological point of view?
Mm-hmm. I think this is an interesting question. Of course, of course, there is some sort of difference between Turkey and Saudi Arabia in terms of the interpretation of Islam, of course, but of course, I cannot give detail about the ontology of Islam in terms of the difference between two countries, but in terms of religious religious influence over the politics, is interpreted differently. Of course, Turkey is, to my understanding, is promoting the moderate idea, interpretation of Islam, that while Saudi Arabia is promoting more a Salafi, Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. This is also the main, I think, reason why Turkey is working with different non-state military actors in the region, while Saudi Arabia is working with the different types of non-state military organization actors in the region. But the interpretation of Islam is different, I think, between two countries in terms of politics.
Thank you, Murat. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but the organizers have asked me to put an end to this session because we have exceeded this session time allocated by like 15 minutes. I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd like the audience. Thank you very much.